everybody. Tonight we have two special guests. These women have earned the Teacher of the Year award in their school districts. Let's hear about their journey to receiving these prestigious awards. Let's give a big warm welcome to Susie Johnson. Hello, Susie.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here today.
So are we. So, Susie, tell us about your first year of teaching.
Well, it was rough. My classes were a disaster. I didn't know how to handle the storm that came at me. I just could barely keep my head above water, you know. I grew up in a very white neighborhood, and so I wasn't really exposed to the kind of experiences a diverse classroom would bring.
Wow, that sounds pretty intense. So tell us then, what changed? How did you overcome these challenges?
Well, I had the opportunity to take a few summer classes to help me prepare for the next school year. One of these classes was a multicultural education class. It was actually really helpful. It was just what I needed to open my mind to the diversity in my classroom and what I could do about it.
Wow, what an excellent thing. Tell us about what you learned in this class.
Oh, wow, where to begin? Well, at first I guess I should say my mind was open to diversity and the potential problems that could arise from this diversity. Before this class, I was unaware of the importance that language played in my classroom. I didn't understand that students, first and foremost, have primary discourse in the language that they use in their homes. I realized that I had to figure out a way to help them gain a secondary discourse so that they could be successful in school. I recognized that it was my job as the teacher to be a tool in helping them acquire this secondary discourse. One of the ways I did this was by teaching them the vocabulary needed to do well in the course. I learned that in my multicultural class that this vocabulary is called academic language. Academic language is something all students need to learn to do well in school. My class taught me that this idea relates to cultural capital. Cultural capital is having resources and abilities to be able to function in a cultural context. I did not realize that there was even such a thing. I mean, it was pretty crazy learning about this.
Yeah.
When I taught my students the academic language, I was giving them a tool that they'd be able to use in the school culture.
Wow, that sounds like a pretty daunting task. So how did you go about using/implementing these discourses in your classroom?
Well, you know, it required me to be aware of the backgrounds of my students, because then, with that knowledge, I could understand what tools I needed to give them to do well in my class.
Interesting.
So, at the beginning of the year, I spent some time to get to know my students. I started off letting them use their primary discourse, so remember the language that they use in their home.
Right.
And then, gradually, as I planned the units and taught them the vocabulary that they needed, I encouraged them to use that vocabulary and incorporate the concepts and vocabulary that they would be able to have so that they could be successful in school.
Whew, what a process. Did you have any help in accomplishing this?
You know, actually, I did. As I got to know my students, there was this one student in particular. I still remember his name was Johnny. He was the cutest thing. Well, but you know, Johnny became my friend and he taught me the ways of the classroom and the classmates so that I could connect to them better.
I see.
Yeah, and so because of that connection, I was able to reach out to them. And, you know, now come to think of it, I actually think he was creating social capital for me.
What is that?
Oh, right, sorry. You know, social capital is the people you know. So it's kind of like the networks that you create to be successful in any cultural context.
Uh-huh.
So now that I'm thinking about it more, I can be an element of social capital for my students. I know, novel idea.
An insight.
I know. I can be a friend to my students so that they can use me as a part of their own social capital to get involved in school and society.
Cool. What an excellent idea. So maybe one last question for you, Susie. With your new knowledge, how are you able to teach your diverse group of students?
Oh boy. Well, first off, I had to learn that they couldn't grasp everything that I taught. What I ended up having to do was focus my lessons on the important messages that I wanted them to learn. I had to realize that the comprehensible input my students were gaining was more important than the exact wording of what I was trying to say. It was hard, but I realized that this was the way that my students were actually able to learn something in my class. Another way I found that helped the students learn was by focusing on them and what they already know. I was accessing the students' funds of knowledge as I did this. Yeah. So I was able to give them opportunities to relate what they were learning in class to their own lives and cultures. By using this kind of inclusive pedagogy, my students were able to learn the difficult concepts and retain them because they could actually relate it to something they already knew. It was a long and hard journey, but I'm so glad that I learned all these aspects so that I could apply it into my teaching and make my classroom a better learning environment. You know, I really hope that I can continue implementing these practices in my teaching in the years to come.
What an inspiring story, isn't it, folks? Thank you so much for being here today, Susie, and we wish you luck in your endeavors.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Next up, we have Mrs. Doris Smith.
Mrs. Smith, we're so glad you could join us here tonight.
Well, it's pretty late to be here on TV.
Well, we're just glad you could make it. So, Doris, tell us about how you ended up with this prestigious award.
Well, after these 20 long years of teaching, my knowledge has finally come to use. When I took teaching classes back in the day, they taught us the way to teach, and that was the way it was. This worked great, fine and dandy for the white students, but we couldn't just reach those colored ones.
Well, how'd you overcome this challenge?
Well, quite grudgingly, truth be told. We got a new principal, and he was all about change, and he forced all the teachers to take a multicultural education class. I thought this was stupid, because the way schools are, the way teachers are, were just fine for most of the students. Why do we need to change for the minority? You know what I'm saying? But I went anyways, and it turned out to be pretty useful.
Oh yeah? Interesting. In what ways was it useful for you?
Well, I realized that my teaching was very hegemonic.
Oh, that's a big word. What does it mean?
I'm surprised you don't know that word. Clearly it means that I was teaching in a way that made my culture dominant in the classroom.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for that enlightenment. Please continue with your tale.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, where was I? Oh yes, my multicultural class. That class, I learned not only that my teaching was forcing my culture on my students, but so was the way the school was set up. What did they call it? Oh yeah, institutional racism. So basically, the way the school was set up, including my classroom, with the straight rows of desks and the seating arrangements as well. I always stuck the smart ones in the front, my favorites, you know, and those troublesome colored ones in the back. They just were so strugglesome, I couldn't even handle it. But after taking this class, I realized that it was partly my own fault and partly the school's fault for perpetuating the students' feelings of inferiority in the classroom. So, I began to randomize the seating chart and rearrange the desks so that I could promote more discussion between the students. I found that this helped eliminate some of the feelings of animosity in my classroom.
Well, that's fabulous. I'm so glad you discovered that. Isn't that amazing,
Yeah,
folks?
that's great, but I wasn't done talking. I still have a lot of things to say.
I'm sorry. Please continue.
Yeah, I will, thank you very much. So the next thing I learned was that my values were different than my students. I wanted my students to be focused and hardworking at all times. There would be no goofing off. But no, my students insisted on throwing things and being disruptive. I realized that if I was going to get anywhere with my students, I would have to think of ways to incorporate their values with mine. So I had them write down a list of their values, and I wrote down mine. Then together, we formed a list of rules that we would all agree to follow. This helped my students know what I expect, but in a way that they were willing to comply with. As I was saying, I realized that I could be an agent of change if I just altered my set ways. So in order to be the kind of teacher that encouraged improvement and change, I had to undergo some serious critical self-analysis. I had to examine my biases, my prejudices, my values, and then I had to decide which of these was detrimental in the classroom and come up with ways that I could alter these so that instead they helped, not hindered my students. For example, I realized that I always called on the same students, which didn't allow all of them to voice their opinions. In response to this bias, I discovered group work solves the problem. It allowed all the students to talk with each other and help each other learn the material. It was only after this critical process of critical self-evaluation that I was able to implement change in my classroom. I admit, if it weren't for that multicultural class, I might never have changed my ways for the better.
Wow, what a wonderful message for us all. Thank you so much for your time and sacrifice of sleep to be here with us. Let's give these ladies a round of applause. Well, this has been a night full of inspiring stories. You know, it seems like every teacher out there ought to take a multicultural class because look at what these great teachers learned. Susie learned that to be a teacher of diverse students, you have to actually know and understand your students so that you can adapt your teaching to their learning capabilities. That way, the students can gain the tools and have the networks that they need to succeed in school. Our pleasant friend Doris taught us that maybe the way the schools are set up and the way the teachers teach aren't always the best methods in this changing world. So, teachers need to actually analyze themselves so that they can become agents of change. What great lessons, and hopefully you teachers out there can take some of the methods that they used and apply them into your own teaching. Well, thank you all for being here and see you next time on Nightline News. Have a good night.